Welcome to the Adams County Historical Society. It's indeed an honor to be presenting with my dear friend Sue Boardman information about Elizabeth Thorn, the history of Evergreen Cemetery, the Thorns, which evolved into eventually, of course, the Civil War Women's Memorial that was placed in 2002, and leading up through the recently released children's book, Evergreen Gettysburg Tale, that will benefit the restoration of the Evergreen Cemetery Gatehouse. I'm so thankful that you all came out to celebrate Elizabeth, all things Elizabeth, and I thank Sue for joining in helping to honor Elizabeth today. Now, in 1976, my father became the 8th caretaker of Evergreen Cemetery. We moved into the Gatehouse in March of 1976. Previously, he was the superintendent of the Gettysburg Country Club. Now, this is an image of our father when he was in the Navy. And prior to that, what a life my father got to live. He was a Boy Scout. So in 1938, when they had the reunion, he was given the job of being Mary Pickford, her courier. So he was her errand boy during the reunion. A lot of the Boy Scouts were helping with the soldiers.
And she came back in 1941 with Mrs. Longstreet. She came back in 1941 to dedicate, to break ground for the Longstreet Memorial with Mrs. Longstreet, with Helen. So he probably got to see her then too. They knew each other.
Well, probably not. My guess is probably not. I feel that was sort of a one instance thing where he got the honor of being her courier. But a lot of younger people don't realize how big Mary Pickford was at that time, especially being the top silent screen star. Now, Dad just happened to be at the country club when they called and asked for a caddy. The first time the president was to golf at the country club. So he went on to caddy for the president, spent over 1,000 hours while Ike was president and in his retirement. So they developed a very nice, unique friendship. And when you consider that Ike was the golfing president, with television, it was really taking off in the 1950s. It coincided with, in eventuality, the popularity of Arnold Palmer. So Arnold Palmer came to Gettysburg September 9th, 1960, to play a round of golf and to give lessons to the president. And this is, you'll see Arnie on the right, my dad with his back to the camera, and Ike. This would have been during a time when Mr. Palmer was helping with President's swing. And fortunately, my father, if you see the golf bag that's there, that is the set of clubs that the president donated to my father, which in turn were donated to Mr. Palmer around 2011. They became his prized possession of his collection. This is one of my favorite images of the Gatehouse. It's an infrared image. And it's my favorite modern photograph of the Gatehouse. So we moved in to the Gatehouse in 1976, and my dad got acclimated with the help of Howard Kitzmiller, who was the superintendent of Evergreen between 1947 and 1974. But what was interesting at that young age, I didn't realize how much my father was interested in history. So he started reading the burial permits, the minute book, and started obtaining all this information about the history of Evergreen. So little did I know this was going on. I was too busy out mowing grass and raking leaves and doing, working after schools. But meanwhile, my father was becoming, in some ways, maybe the expert on Evergreen history. And by the end of the 1970s, probably early 80s, he started giving tours of the cemetery. Now, he knew other history from the 1900s and certain stories about certain people that were buried there, but he started to really tell the story of Elizabeth Thorn. Now, at that age, I didn't know how often that was being told in town. Throughout the decades here at Gettysburg, Sue can attest to this, the change in teaching and also businesses promoting civilian history here at Gettysburg. What year did you come here to Gettysburg, Sue?
Well, I moved here in 98, but I started guiding in 01. Sorry.
Okay.
Moved in 98, guided starting in 01.
Yeah, so you saw that change during your years here. So Dad would always end his tours. He told me he would say there ought to be a statue to this woman. Not just for her, but for all the women who did in various capacities before, during, and after the battle for the town and their families.
Thank you, Brian. All right, so if we're going to talk about legacy of Elizabeth, let me just define legacy. Legacy is the long-lasting impact of an event or a life. And this woman had an impact on not only on the Civil War story, but on the continuing story of the evolution of Gettysburg as a tourist attraction. So let's start with, and my job is just to give you just this little encapsulated look at who she was, and then Brian will take it back to the legacy again, okay? So Elizabeth Thorn came to America in 1854 with her parents, Catherine and John Masser, sometimes seen as Moser. What do you think it is, Masser?
I usually use Masser.
Yeah, that's.
But I can't say. I'm not a good one to ask because my name's really Kennell, but we've
Really?
always said Kennell.
That's interesting.
Maybe it was kennel ration dog food growing up, you know. But
So you
it's
changed
really
it.
Kennell.
Okay,
So
good to know.
either or, I'm
Okay, well,
comfortable.
I think I've even used it two different ways in the book based on whether it was her account or the parents are buried in Evergreen, right?
Yes.
So what do the stones say?
Masser.
Masser. Oh, we're going with Masser.
That's how we
here.
read it. I don't know.
Yeah, we
how-
always go with the
Yeah.
with the dead record, always. All right. So anyway, in 1852, 2 years prior to her arrival, Peter arrived. They did not come together. They did not know each other. But sometime between their separate arrivals and 1855, September to be exact, Elizabeth and Peter met, courted, and got engaged. So, two things cool happened on September 1st, 1855, and I probably should keep up with myself here, right? Okay. So, 1855, September 1st, the cornerstone of this beautiful edifice was laid. Bells all over town were ringing, and Elizabeth, because it was her wedding day, thought they were ringing on her behalf. It's kind of a cool irony because at that point they had no idea they were actually going to take up residence in this building for almost 20 years. So, sure enough, February of 1856, Peter became, sorry, I'm a little ahead of myself. Peter became the keeper of the cemetery. First ever superintendent. You're number 8? You're number 9? You're number 9.
I'm number 9, counting Elizabeth as 2, which we do.
You count Elizabeth as
Yep.
2. That's pretty cool.
Yep.
Anyway, I think that's a pretty remarkable history of a cemetery that's 160 what years old, and it's only had 8 caretakers, 9 caretakers. It's pretty long. The job carries longevity, apparently. But anyway, so by the time of the Civil War, Catherine, her parents, and then her family began to grow. So they got married in 1855. By the opening of the Civil War in 1861, there were 3 sons as well. We have Fred, George, and John. John was just a baby, so you just have Fred and George sitting there on a stoop in the archway. In any case, they lived in 4 rooms in the gatehouse. Okay, so now in August 1862, Peter went off to war. There was a huge call for volunteers in the summer of 1862. Many regiments were formed. Peter became a member of Company B, 138th Pennsylvania Volunteers. They were not in the Gettysburg campaign. They were in charge of the defenses of Baltimore. So he's not that far away. But 60 miles is 60 miles when you don't have automobiles, right? So anyway, so all is good until, of course, the summer of 1863, when, as we know, the war comes to Gettysburg. At that point, Cemetery Hill becomes the focal point of the Union fishhook line, and the gatehouse itself becomes the headquarters of General Howard's 11th Corps. So here's Elizabeth home, now becoming the headquarters of a commander in the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, she stayed until she stayed all through July 1, and she actually on July 1 took some 11th Corps officers all the way across town on foot to show them the road network. We think she got as far as the Harrisburg Road and the York Road on foot with these officers to show them the way, and then came back. The only reason she took the job, they didn't want her to do it initially. She took it because her father could not speak English. He was German and spoke only German, and the boys were just too young. So she had already an exciting part of this battle. Then the night of July 1, she cooked for a dinner for General Slocum, General Sickles, and General Howard in the gatehouse. At that point, she went to the basement with her family, but she was told by General Howard that he would alert them if they were to vacate, and that happened in the morning of July 2. They fled south along the Baltimore Road to another family and spent their time there until the 5th of July. Some accounts say 6th. She gave some accounts later on for the newspapers, and there's just a little bit of conflict between the accounts, but memories do get old, and sometimes details do too. So in any case, when she came back, she of course was met with, I'm sorry, this is Mrs. Moser. McConaughey met her on the way back. He was the president of the Evergreen Cemetery, and he said she should hurry because there was work to be done. He had a vision in his own head initially that the Soldiers National Cemetery would be incorporated within the Evergreen Cemetery. So he wanted her to get started burying the deceased soldiers on Cemetery Hill so that could get a foothold. So she had only the help of her aging, ailing father, and there was a brief time when 2 men were sent to help her. Another one lasted very long. So she and her dad ended up burying 101-ish. The numbers are kind of, what do you say?
Well, her account, when she wrote the account, I think she was including civilians. So years after having been there, and also not really being involved so much with the record keeping. I think the cemetery board and the secretary and the president handled that. So it's roughly around 91 soldiers, and I think her account may have said 115, but that would have included civilians during that time period of burials.
And just as a quick aside, because it might be of interest, how many are left?
63.
The others were moved over to the National Cemetery when that was created. Okay, so now, the cemetery itself, the cemetery gatehouse, her home was a mess. She is way too preoccupied with these burials to even worry about the fact that her home was a mess. The windows were broken out. The interior was a mess. There were furniture broken or gone, most of her personal belongings. All the food that she had put up in stores to feed her own family, all gone. But at that point, that couldn't be her priority. So, and by the way, the well was also broken. So hard to work without water. The only thing she saw that she had left was that her parlor clock was taken outside and hung in the archway by the soldiers who occupied the building during the battle. That clock, Brian took good care of and is now in the exhibits here in Adams County. Is it in the actual exhibits or in the collection? It's in the actual exhibits.
It's one of the things about living at the gatehouse is you somewhat are always on call. I call it, when I was young, as I was working and as I grew into being the superintendent, it's like being on the farm. My father answered the door on a Sunday afternoon while watching football. And sometimes you might be inclined, it's a weekend, I'm not going to. He answered the door and it was a descendant that wanted to give the clock back home, get it back home to Evergreen.
Isn't that cool?
So that happened in the early 80s.
Now remember, she's 6 months pregnant at this time, burying all these deceased soldiers. The stench in the whole town was unbearable. I can't even fathom what it was like for her. In any case, several months after the battle, she also had to cope with Lincoln's visit and the massive crowds that were in and around Evergreen. Remember, she took over Peter's job as keeper of the cemetery. So these are requests for burials that you see that her name, they're addressed to her. So she had to continue on with recovery from the battle, dealing with the tourists, dealing with the families, and dealing with her own situation. Now, this is Elizabeth, just probably maybe within a couple of years post-battle. She actually was an attractive young lady. But in any case, after the war, Peter comes home in 1865 in June. He had been in a number of battles, had been wounded, gets discharged in June of 1865. And then they're going to remain in the gatehouse because he went back to assuming his responsibilities at the cemetery. So they're going to remain there until 1875. From that point on, they become engaged in other interests, other vocations. They farm. He becomes the innkeeper of the Battlefield Hotel. Used to be at the corner of, is it Baltimore and Emmitsburg Road?
Yes.
Right? Okay. He was the resident innkeeper. So she worked there, cooking, changing linens in the rooms, washing, keeping the rooms clean, scrubbing. She was a busy lady there too. He also was a short-term superintendent of the National Cemetery when it was required to be a veteran. At first it didn't matter, but then the government decided it should be a veteran. So he got that job for a short time. Then he went back to farming, and then he went, then they just retired. So basically, I think we have another picture of them as a couple. They are a little bit later in life. So finally, they are going to retire to a home on Middle Street in Gettysburg and die within 9 months of each other. I know, this happens a lot, believe it or not. In 1907, she was 74 and he was 80. She had lived in Gettysburg from the age of 22 her entire life, never living more than 2 miles from the town square. So here's just a real quick map of where she lived. I thought it had numbers on it, but it doesn't. Okay, so let's do this. First house was actually built up here north of town on North Washington Street. When they first got married, Peter had bought a piece of land and started to build a house, which they never ever lived in because he got the job at the cemetery and they moved into the gatehouse. So he sold that house 2 years after it was built. So technically it's their house, but technically she never lived in it. Then of course we have the gatehouse, which they lived in from 1856 when he got the job, all the way up until 1875 when he retired. But when he was planning retirement, they built a farmhouse just down the Baltimore Road, which would be, let's see, just down, whoops, sorry, wait a minute. Sorry, down the Baltimore Pike. Wasn't it contiguous to what our modern boundary of the Evergreen? It was just south of that, where this farm was that they built.
I think it was further down.
A little further down?
Somewhere near where Lincoln Social.
Yes.
Which is no longer open.
Which was Big Boppers, and then it was something else, and then it was something else. Yeah, that. Okay, anyway. So they lived there and then went to do the innkeeping job and then came back there, and then it was 50 West Middle Street was where they spent the last 5 years of their lives, and then that's where they lived when they both died. So with that, I'm going to give it back to talk about legacy, but if you want the details, it's in this book. Okay?
Thank you, Sue. I'm just going to backtrack here because I'm going to backtrack to something that happened this spring. My father had collected images of Peter Thorne that he was given from the Thorne family, and we always had 2 images of paintings, the paintings of Peter and Elizabeth, probably circa 1900. So I get a phone call from Ann Pierce, a descendant of Elizabeth and Peter Thorne, saying that she thought that with everything that's being done at the gatehouse, improvements with the Women's Memorial, that they thought that the family thought that they should come to the gatehouse. So these two paintings now hang in the original room where Elizabeth fed the generals. And I must say, every time I see the painting of Elizabeth, I think of Tweety Bird. If you're familiar, if you're familiar with the lady in the Tweety Bird cartoons with Sylvester, I always am reminded.
I'm glad you clarified. I thought you meant she looked like Tweety Bird.
No. No, the lady that was so sweet in those cartoons. Now, this was something else that a picture of this was given from the Thorne family. This is from a 1937 illustration story of Elizabeth showing the soldiers across town, the roads leading into Gettysburg. Now, one of the things here, we have General Howard with two arms, okay? So that wasn't true. He lost part of his arm at the Battle of Fair Oaks, Virginia. But it was always neat to see this and to celebrate what Elizabeth did as part of her duties as caretaker at the cemetery. Back around, this was, I can't remember exactly what year it was, but after the Women's Memorial was erected in 2002, dedicated, I started searching on eBay, and this shaving mug of Peter Thorne's was up for bid. Now, at that time, the seller wanted $2,000 for it. And I didn't have the foresight to buy it. I didn't have the money at that time. I was recording music. I was in the midst of a project, but I really should have gone to a donor. This would have been a very important piece to have at the gatehouse, but I did get an image of it, and it shows Peter standing in the archway, and I thought that was just a unique piece of art, and I didn't really know that men had their own shaving mugs, and this would have been at his son Fred's barbershop in town. Just one of those things that slipped through my fingers, and I wish, but at least we have an image of it. So we get to around 1997, and I had been caretaker for 6 years. And before that, I can't remember what year, but there was the Friend to Friend Monument was dedicated in the National Cemetery, and John Schwartz, who was on the board of trustees at Evergreen, was very much involved with the concept of that statue. So, after hearing Dad say so many times there should be a monument to the women of Gettysburg, we finally got started on one. So, the committee was formed, and Sue happened to be on that committee. We didn't even do a search. We knew we wanted Ron to do the statue, that he was the person to do the statue. So we chose Ron. He started, of course, making sketches of what Elizabeth would look like and what she'd be doing. And I recall grabbing a shovel on a sunny afternoon and being out in the backyard behind the gatehouse. And not all of these were based on my positions of carrying a pickaxe or whatever. But anyhow, Ron had been making these, and you can see that it does say 1997 here below, Ron Tunison. I'm very thankful he did that because it helps me to remember when it all started. So, various positions of what Elizabeth would be doing. He asked me, you know, and I took the shovel and I had it gone down in the ground. And this ended up being, personally, my favorite. Showing the strength and resolve of the women of Gettysburg. But the committee had to balance what was going to be appropriate for a monument in the cemetery. And Sue remembers me saying time and time again that this is our Lizzie Borden, Elizabeth Thorn,
It's true.
which was quite striking. And artistically, the angles and everything was beautiful. But when you put up a statue, you have to think of a lot of things. You have to think of things being out from the core of the statue, what people might hang off of, jump up onto. All these things you have to think about. So, one of the things that I did do, and having dug 3 graves within 10 feet from where Elizabeth and her father buried those soldiers, very rocky soil. And back then, you didn't have a company like C. Williams that could come bail you out. And I got to give a tip of the cap to C. Williams throughout our years at Evergreen with the rock and diabase that we hit. Whenever we had a problem, they had somebody out there that day or the next day. So, Jim Williams, I thank you very much for all those years of helping Evergreen. So, Elizabeth, wiping her brow. So the fact that I don't have a lot of hair on my head, and I didn't back in 1997, I remember digging those graves, backfilling, and looking down the valley across Cemetery Hill to Culp's Hill and wiping my brow. And that became indirectly a part of the pose of Elizabeth.
Except for one thing. Ron Tunison knew that if you put a sculpture outside, that you have to make it slightly bigger than life because it will be lost in the surroundings. So it has to be a little bit bigger. So that means if I, a 5-foot person, walked up to her in this pose, I'd be looking straight up her nose. And that's pretty much what canceled this one. They didn't want anybody looking up her nose. But check the hand on the belly of the pregnant woman. Isn't that the typical stance once you get to be a certain point? Yeah.
Yeah, that's something I hadn't had the experience in to be able to make that recommendation. But Sue, the women on Mary Lou Schwartz, Dev Novotny, and Sue said, oh, she wouldn't have her hand there or whatever. So this became the next phase, which eventually became the final phase of Ron working on the clay at his studio in New York, and the detail, wiping her brow, but with her eyes closed, looking down. It was interesting, Sue. There were years later, a few years after the monument was dedicated, I got an email from a teacher who taught women's history in a college in Maryland, and she said, how could you put Elizabeth in such a defeated pose? And I wrote back to her and I said, well, if she had just buried all these soldiers in the Rocky regions, she's going to look tired. It has to represent the hours and the tireless efforts of all the women. So we tend to disagree that we feel it does capture, for a cemetery, the essence of women and what they accomplished. Now, these are a few images of the mold after it was broken and when they started piecing together the bronze. And you'll see sections where they actually had to reach in and be able to pull out material from the interior. And then as they start to piece it together in its finality, this is the last image that I have, but I do have with me her hand that Ron gave to the cemetery, the hand that would be wiping her brow. And I'll have this down at the table so that if you want to touch it, it's just the clay, but that was a nice piece for Ron to give us. You know, I don't know how many pieces of clay there are in town of monuments that are on the battlefield. I think somebody said they had one. I just can't remember which it was. Now, the butterflies there with the start of a project butterflies are reborn, and it's symbolism for death and being reborn. So we got butterflies from a butterfly farm. A butterfly just didn't land on there. We released them, but I wanted to incorporate that as part of this image. Now this just doesn't happen every day, and I probably have seen three or four times where it was good to photograph, where I remember walking outside and I thought we were going to get an ice storm. I mean a serious ice storm. And I thought we have a lot of cleanup at the cemetery. So I thought I would be getting some good photographs of the cemetery in ice. So I was spreading salt and I walked, there wasn't ice in the trees. You got to remember, metal gets colder. So I turn and this is what I see. So there are various times that the temperature and the amount of water will just be right to capture that. But one of my favorite images of Elizabeth. Now here's the true caretaker of Elizabeth, Andrew Baxter. He has been cleaning and waxing Elizabeth since 2003. There was 1 year where he couldn't, where his partner did it. And proudly, and it's just when you put up a monument, you're supposed to take care of them. This is the most memorialized battlefield in the world. It's hard for the Park Service to do this, but the fact that we have Jenny Waite's statue with D2 cleaners and with Elizabeth Thorn with cleaning and waxing, that you are able to keep a monument the way it looks years afterwards. And actually the monument cures in a way that in some ways when it's first placed, it gets better looking each year. That's what Andrew, and this is an expert because he has cleaned monuments in Richmond, across the Northeast. He is an expert, and we are so happy to have him be Elizabeth's caretaker. Mary, could you come here? This is when I was growing up, right across from my favorite restaurant in town, the Dobbin House, because you can see the parking area where the Dobbin House is before Jackie purchased it to make it a restaurant. I used to walk across the street to the soda machine to get my Mountain Dews when it was a museum. But this is when I was a child with our dog Misty, and you can see the Oriole helmet, the Oriole fan, and you can see a fence that was once along where the coffee shop is now. Okay, so that's where I grew up. Okay, would you be able to switch? Living at the cemetery, you're around animals. And that was why I went there as a child, because of the nature. And I still have relationship with animals even after the fact. If you could hit play. This happens to be a little rabbit that I befriended by the name of Fella. And I'm like a foot away with my camera filming Fella. Fella would befriend me and come running up to me, wanting me. I only gave him dandelions. I didn't give him special food. But this was Fella, and Fella was a very special animal in my time. This is Ringo. And there was a day that was the worst day in my life at Evergreen, where they were talking about burning a flag, and there were all these AR-15s lined up with people carrying them up Baltimore Pike and in the cemetery. And that evening, I found Ringo in the back part of the cemetery in a tree, looked like he was starving. I was watering Richard Mancini's flowers, and I gave Ringo some water while he started coming to the boxwood tree. And he got healthier, and he is one that I did actually feed apples and peanut butter to. Thank you so much. So little did I know that Fella would end up being part of the new book we named Fella. So back when the statue was dedicated, I thought of a different project, and that would be to tell Elizabeth Thorn's story through the eyes of the animals at Evergreen. Because when we were kids, we would hunt insects, we would go to the soldier cemeteries. Elementary school used to take the classes to the National Cemetery to get leaf samples to put in construction paper book that you would create. And so Evergreen as a child, nature sanctuary, animals, trees, and I wanted to have this book done. But in the meantime, I was doing music. I was writing music, recording music, and I didn't have the resolve to write this book. And it turns out that I met Christopher Oakley, became friends with him, and one day I was talking with him. He heard me talk about this children's book because Christopher teaches animation at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. And he said, well, why don't you let me write it? I said, go for it. So this started over 3 years ago, the development of this book, and we wanted to tell Elizabeth Thorn's story so that children would get interested in. Does anybody? Oh, there's a clock. Oh, thank you. There is a clock back there. I just want to make sure we're on time. So, wanted this book to engage young people. And I use this, I know people have heard this before whenever I talk about the Historical Society. And one of the things I notice from a third person is Andrew Dalton, growing up in this area, getting involved in learning about history, and going through his path, and then being involved in making a difference along with so many great people of the Historical Society that have banded together to create this wonderful building that we're in, and the museum. And Mary Lou Schwartz, my dear friend, was very involved, brought me out to the Historical Society. So I just see the difference that a young person's interest in history can make. So the intent was to leave something behind now that I'm 62 and seeing the end of the tunnel of my years at Evergreen. I'm not there yet, I hope not, but of seeing something that would be a legacy that could be left, that children would experience the wonder and the fascination of Evergreen Cemetery, that it's just not a cemetery, that it is a place of life. So this became Evergreen, thanks to Christopher and his work in the story, and Jacob Rozier, his former student, who did all the images. Now, I had the honor of working on Jacob. I released an anthology in music. I said, enough of the music, I want to concentrate on Evergreen. Jacob did a lot of illustrations for me in previous years, and it was a no-brainer who we were going to have do the illustrations for the book. And Jacob did a splendid job between all the animals, Elizabeth, and what became the book Evergreen. So, Elizabeth has 3 boys, but to streamline it, we have to have one that would be the sole subject as a child. So we chose George, because George was about 5 years old. He was 5 years old at the time of the battle. Coincidentally, the same age I was on my first trips to Evergreen. Growing up on Steinway, there were 2 ladies that lost their husbands, and they would take me as a young boy to Evergreen. That was my first experience, taking flowers to their grave sites. But I didn't notice the gatehouse so much then. So it wasn't until I befriended a family around 1970, 71, the Illenbergers, who lived in the National Cemetery Gatehouse. And we had a friend, Carl Baum, who lived behind the Hall of Presidents Museum, that we would walk his 2 dogs, Shotzi and Lucky. More Shotzi because Lucky was a little bit temperamental. She was a husky and was up in years. So it was interesting that we chose George to be the one who has the connection with the animals. Now this is an easy one. Dad in 1980 started putting bluebird houses out in the cemetery so that you would get 100 birds each year fledged from these boxes. And I ran cross country 1 year in high school. I never saw a bluebird once while I was running. I was familiar with robins and cardinals and blue jays. But soon, the bluebird population, along with the help of other people, it was a trend, putting up bluebird houses, took off. And now when you go across the southern part of the battlefield, you see a lot of bluebirds. So it was an easy take to make Arthur the bluebird. Now Arthur's also one of the two wise sages. He has the aerial view of Evergreen. Now Spruce. Now this, Sue, I have to tell you, I have to tell everybody, we were itching to name the squirrel.
I can't believe you're going to think that.
Well, I am, because the squirrel understands English. He understands human speak. The squirrel is very knowledgeable about Evergreen as a whole. He's our Gandalf. So we were going to name him Fraz.
Now it's out.
We were going to name him Fraz. So in this day of having a computer, you can do Google searches. And poor Bill Frazanito, we were not able to name the smartest animal Fraz because Disney already had a squirrel named Fraz. So we sidestepped that. So we named him Spruce. Now Spruce has a Boxwood School, which we'll see. Fella, of course, was easy. The rabbit that I had befriended. Fella actually got into my house, into the gatehouse, through a hole, and I was watching TV, and I have a recycle bin in above the steps that leads from the kitchen to the cellar. And I hear, like, who's out in the kitchen? Rattling bottles, and Fella had gotten into the house, gone up the stairs, and jumped into the recycle bin. I am not lying. I had to take Fella outside and say, don't ever do that again. You could get trapped down here. Finn became the chipmunk, and they are best friends. You have a girl chipmunk and Fella, the boy. And I named him Fella because I didn't know whether he was a girl or a boy. And Fella sort of had, feminine or male, Fella and Finn, best friends. Eli the Grump. Original concept was that Eli was a Southern sympathizer, that he was upset that he was at the gatehouse, that he was with the Thorns, and he wanted to be set free, and that the Confederates, when they came on June 26th, was going to release him. So he's the crotchety old goat. Graham's not too bright. Graham reminds me of my cat Molly, bless her heart. She was the sweetest girl, but she wasn't as smart as the other cats. And Graham thinks he understands English too. And he speaks out of turn at the Boxwood School. He speaks out of turn everywhere because he thinks he understands what people are talking about. Sky's the vulture who is Arthur's friend and would fly during the sequences of the battle. So Sky also has a view. And we also have Maple, who was the bouncy animal. Friendly, happy Maple, the fox. It's interesting. This was about 5 years ago. I was coming into the cemetery, and we had a fox that was coming to the boxwood tree. And this fox, I never was around a young fox to realize how playful they are. And it would peek out from a stone, and then it would go back and peek out again, and prance to the next stone and peek out. It was almost playing hide and seek with me. Now, on the southwestern part of the cemetery lies the grove of trees. And that's where the night creatures exist. So we have our own diversity in animals here at Evergreen. We got the animals frontal towards the gatehouse, and we have the night creatures that everybody fears because they come and steal the blackberries. They come and eat the blackberries, and the animals are told by their parents, do not go to the grove of trees. Do not go. They can't be trusted. You do not know what's out there. So, the grove of trees. Think if you come through the gatehouse, you go up, the rocky center is where the Brown family mausoleum, the soldiers' monument is over here. And as you go back to where the rostrum currently sits, when you used to come in from the visitor center and the cyclorama in through the National Cemetery, that hillside as it drops down was where the grove of trees was. And Sue knows there's a lot of images from Little Round Top that are shot towards Cemetery Ridge and the grove of trees that sits high on Cemetery Ridge. So we made a map where the animals, where their homes were, where the gatehouse, you can see Eli, you can see Spruce with the boxwood. Now, we had to name the grove of trees animals. Back when I was in junior high school, I would come home from school, and I'd see this man walking around the cemetery with his book, not talking to anybody really. He was doing his research, and it was Bill Frazanito. I didn't know what he was doing. I just knew he was here a lot. And he eventually befriended my father, talked to my father, would show him records, but there happened to be a woman doing it too. And her name was Burl McPherson. And she would write articles for the Gettysburg Times and have them placed. So we needed a name for a bat. And I thought, Burl the Bat. So not that she was batty, she was very interesting. It's just, it was the first thing that came to mind, and in honor of her being an Evergreen historian from my early years, we named the bat Burl. Luna the skunk. I told Jacob that I sort of wanted a mohawk on Luna, so he did a partial mohawk on Luna. And Clover, opossum. And Kitsy, the raccoon, who's a pack rat, who likes to find things in the cemetery after the battle, pick them up and drag them back to his home. So Kitsy was an easy one. Kitsy, when I was 13, 14 years old, Kitsy would talk to me. He used to wash his car at the lower pump. So since he was caretaker, he felt he could wash his car at Evergreen. So it was nice to name Kitsy. And Kitsy, when I got to the 80s and I had a mullet, Kitsy would always say, get a haircut, get a haircut. So whenever Kitsy died, I took clippers and clipped off all my hair to go to his service. So Jacob, being in North Carolina, needed images of the gatehouse, of various things, people, to incorporate images for the book. So here we have George playing with the animals. This is on the back of the book. We show the rear of the gatehouse. And people often ask, was there ever a way to walk from one side to the other? And if you can see the steps that are leading down, you would walk across the road, up the steps, and into the office. And so we have George with Spruce, Finfella, Graham, and Maple playing in the cemetery. So we had to have a start to the story. And Christopher Oakley was here as a child, and he was so taken in by the gatehouse, as I was. So he made himself the young boy that happens to be looking up into the window and sees two mice. He sees Crooked Tail waving to him. And he's like, wow, this is really cool. Meanwhile, his parents are being given a tour by Deb Novotny. So, but I didn't want to call her Deb. Deb's if you do not know this, Deb's a huge Neil Diamond fan. So, what other name would we use than Rosie? Oh, Cracklin' Rosie, get on board. You know, that type of thing. Deb became Rosie, which was a tribute to her love of Neil Diamond. Now here's Crooked Tail breaking into the story. He's going to tell all the mice the story of Elizabeth Thorn and the family and the animals that lived there. Now you happen to see in the photo one of our fundraising items. We sold these to raise funds for the statue. This one happens to have a piece of brick. That was the special edition. So we wanted to incorporate a few things, Elizabeth, in this. So we put the statue, we put the clock, and we put the burial records that have the soldiers that she buried, the burial book.
The brick, Brian had to have some work done around the foundation of the gatehouse and uncovered some bricks. So that's an actual piece of one of the bricks from the underground of the gatehouse.
Thank you for bringing that point. The boxwood, if you're on the National Cemetery side of the gatehouse along Baltimore Street, you will see a boxwood. And in my early years at Evergreen, I would say to Dad, this would be so much nicer of a yard if this was open, that we could have a rest area, we could have a picnic area. And he goes, that boxwood was here at the time of the battle. You cannot take that down. That was just joshing him a little bit. But that happens to be a haven for animals and birds. So that's why we wanted to incorporate. People will say, are there any more witness trees at the cemetery? No, the last one came down around 1996. Lightning strike near the James Geddes Monument. And I was like, how do they know that he said, that's been passed down from caretaker to caretaker. Well, here is Mame Trossel, who lived there with her husband, Harry, who was a caretaker from around the turn of the century. This is a picture of Mame at the boxwood. And by her height of sitting down, we estimate that somewhere in the 7 to 8 feet high. Now, why would the caretakers lie about this being one of a bush from the time of the battle? So there's Spruce at the boxwood tree, teaching all the animals, trying to get them to understand the grounds, safety, maybe throwing a little word in or two about the English language. Now, there's been a legend. Did you hear this legend as soon after you were into guiding about the sign?
Yeah, I think all guides heard that legend, right, you guys? About the sign at the gatehouse, about firearms. Yeah, that's a pretty common story passed among the guides.
So we thought we would incorporate the sign at the cemetery that all persons found using firearms in these grounds will be prosecuted with the utmost rigor of the law, the Evergreen Cemetery Board of Managers. So we have Arthur on the sign. The real legend is that it was struck by a shell while they were reading it, and the officer said,
Well, I guess that law's been rescinded.
yep.
That law's been rescinded.
So the Confederates come to Evergreen. We have George and Fred on the steps. We have Eli, like, oh my, look who's coming. So we have Elizabeth's mom giving water, drinks to the Confederate soldiers. Now in the south wing, the bedroom upstairs, you still have this view and that view. And that's where, Sue, you know, the photograph taken, Peter Weaver,
Yeah.
that you can see actually, was it Gardner at the other end shooting towards the gatehouse?
Yes.
You could actually see a camera if you expand the view. And that was the famous view looking out towards the speaker stand. A lot of people aren't familiar which side of the archway. It was on the southern side. So we incorporated Opa, Elizabeth's father, reading Grimm's fairy tales to the children to keep them occupied. Grimm's fairy tales originated from Germany, so we thought that would be fitting. The Rocky Center. And it wasn't until early photography at Gettysburg that I saw a picture of what was known as the Rocky Center. And whose headquarters supposedly this was?
Howard.
General Howard. And it's on one of the
It's written right on the stereo view.
On the stereo view. That it makes sense that Howard may have gone back into the cemetery. So this is where the animals are playing hooky, Finn, Fella, and Maple. But there happens to be a creature within the rocks, and that happens to be Czar, the snake. And Arthur intercedes, comes down, and says, "Can't you let them play in your lair?" And Czar winds up letting Arthur go. Arthur wanted to get close to him, so he knew that Czar would wrap him up and bring him close. The Huber Monument, one of our battle-damaged stones. And what's interesting about, there's always new discoveries, always things that you learn when you're at the cemetery. And it's just recently, my friend Tom McMillan happened to be out there with me and pointed out a monument 2 rows behind that the top was missing. And from a shell from the second day bombardment on Evergreen, most likely knocked the top of it off, just like the Huber Monument. He was a Civil War veteran, and his death, along with Nesbitt Bacher, led to McConaughey developing the plan for a soldier cemetery here at Gettysburg. George, as the animals are stealing some of the bread, the mice, the clock is falling off in the cellar. And the clock, as Sue stated, that was hung on the interior of the brick of the archway as you entered through. So most likely so the soldiers knew what time it was. And the boys playing checkers while the animals are watching, and Arthur sitting there watching them play. Pumping water for the soldiers. This is an aspect of doing views, illustrations for a children's book. Elizabeth is showing the captain the roads leading into Gettysburg, and we could have put the bonnet on her, but we thought that in a rush she went outside, didn't have it, and didn't have it on at that time. It also, for kids, shows her full face, and we didn't have enough images. We wanted to make sure that we showed her. This is Finn and Fella greeting the horses as they're bringing Taft's battery through back behind the house. This is the Thorns hiding in the cellar during the first day. There were supposedly other people in there, but we wanted to streamline it and not make it too cluttered with too many people. This is where the animals retreat to the grove of trees. They're trying to stuff Eli in the log. They're all banding together for safety. And then they have to retreat back towards the gatehouse before Pickett's charge was going to take place, because the soldiers would have been lined up out Cemetery Ridge.
You noticed the soldiers in the background with a grave marker. It was known that they were laying them down, and Elizabeth was sure it was to protect them. It was probably so the tall ones were laid down so they wouldn't draw fire from the Confederate artillery.
Very good point. Now this is Arthur and Skye watching Pickett's charge. Now, it's a fantasy, it's a book, but having been a big Disney fan and Christopher Oakley working for Disney, we decided to incorporate a little bit of Sleeping Beauty style art that you can see there. So this is one of my favorite views.
My favorite too.
Guess what movie influenced this?
Gone with the Wind, yes.
Yes, Gone with the Wind. Arthur is sitting on the pile of dirt while Elizabeth and her father are burying the dead. So that's the area where I said I had experience in digging 10 feet behind those soldiers. So tip of the cap to Gone with the Wind. This is also there's so many images in this book. Jacob Rozier is so gifted. And this is the encampment that went after the battle when they came back of Skye and Arthur on the gatehouse. And of course, you can see the poplar tree that's there across the road. So we had to have a pinnacle. We had to have the animals under the stand when Lincoln delivers the Gettysburg Address. They were curious after it was built. They went out, fell asleep, and decided to crawl under the stand, fell asleep, and they couldn't get out because people were coming to the cemetery to hear Lincoln deliver the address. And since Sue gets a kick out of this, since we couldn't have Fraz be the squirrel in the story, we put a young Bill Frazanito
Off the back of Journey in Time.
So that was our honoring of Bill. And you can see Arthur is seated on the cap. And this is the animals coming to Elizabeth's and Peter's graves. And all the animals are bringing flowers, pine cones, but the descendant of Kitsy is bringing a watch. And that's one of my favorite things. These are just quick images. The dog at H.J. Staley's lot. We have the animals playing at the dog. We have the ganging up on Gardner with the animals coming up on Gardner. We have Graham trying to impress Luna with his strawberries from Elizabeth and Peter's garden. We have Abe with the bluebird Arthur on top of his cap. And I resolve with the wonderment of Evergreen, of George and Kitsy seeing the firefly and the beauty of that. And we end with the beauty of Arthur and Elizabeth and how Evergreen still to this day is a land of wonder. And Sue, thank you so much for coming and honoring Elizabeth and the animals. And we've always appreciated her insight to Gettysburg, the cyclorama, what she has done. And on behalf of the cemetery, thank you for writing the book about Elizabeth Thorn and bringing her story, help bringing her story to life for other people, and for all the years of friendship.
Like you, it's a labor of love.
And thank you all for coming.